Crystal Yan, and I'm a product manager at Stripe. But today I'm actually going to travel back in time and tell you a little bit more about some work that I did a few years back when I was working in the government. I'm going to talk about, do a deep dive into a case study that our team worked on the US asylum program at USCIS. And specifically as I go into that, I'm going to share a little bit more about how design and data helped inspire a pivot in the organization's overall strategy. And then I'll end with a few lessons learned that we learned the hard way through practice, through trial and error when doing research with vulnerable communities that hopefully you can all take back to your work in any scenario where you're doing research where you have to invest a little bit more time upfront to build trust with your users. So I said earlier, a lot of this work started through my work at the United States Digital Service at the White House. And this is a group that is a software development and design agency within the federal government. It was founded after the healthcare.gov crisis with the mission to bring human-centered design to deliver better services for the people. And the way a lot of the agency operated is various government officials would come to us and they would ask us to help, often put out a fire. And so one of the fires that we were asked to go investigate was a huge backlog at the time in 2018 and 2019 at USCIS with the backlog in the asylum program. So the head of the Refugee, Asylum, and International Operations Group at US Citizenship and Immigration Services came to us and they asked us, is there something your technology team can do to help us reduce the backlog and improve services for affirmative asylum seekers in the US? And at the time, the backlog was huge. There were about 729,000 asylum seekers in the backlog who were waiting to hear about the status of their case. And this represented about 300,000 cases because oftentimes asylum seekers would apply not only for themselves, but also for their family. And just a little bit of background, because I didn't know this when I first started working on this, is there's actually quite a different distinction between refugee status, affirmative asylum, and defensive asylum. And I'm not sure if you remember, because it was a while back, but at the time there were headlines every single day about the huge influx of people applying for asylum. And we wondered, does this have something to do with the problem we've been asked to investigate? And we learned, even though it wasn't apparent on the surface, it actually did have a huge contribution to the backlog. So a little bit of background, you can be someone who is fleeing persecution from your home country, and if you apply for refugee status in a refugee camp in a third country, you have that status granted before you come to the US and you enter the US with refugee status, then you would be considered a refugee and you would go through one process. If you enter the US through another visa, whether it's a student visa or a tourist visa, and then you apply for asylum after you get to the US, that would be the affirmative asylum process. And then finally, if you're applying at the border, that's a separate process entirely. And so we thought we are really asked to focus on the affirmative asylum process. Whatever's happening in the headlines has nothing to do with us. And little did we know, everything is always more complex under the surface when you're thinking about government services and a lot of the service design that's happening in the agency. Because as it turns out, the asylum officers that actually interview applicants and process the cases and make a decision, there's actually a limited number of asylum officers, and they are assigned to both affirmative and defensive cases. So when there was a huge influx, that meant more asylum officers were being asked to go take a look at the defensive cases, which actually contributed to this backlog in the affirmative cases building up. And so I'm gonna talk and really focus on a lot of the work that we did that was applicant facing and a lot of the services there. But our team also separately invested in tooling for asylum officers because we realized to make them more effective in helping make sure that they're writing up the cases very quickly and getting a decision back. There was a lot that we could do to improve the tooling that they had so they weren't doing a lot of the same work over and over and could get people decisions sooner so they could start planning for their future. So we started off first by defining the problem. And we did a little bit of research with a couple applicants just to set the context and understand what were some of the baseline challenges that applicants were facing. And unsurprisingly, we found that a lot of applicants, they lacked understanding about what was happening next in the process. They felt like they didn't have control over what they could do next because they didn't quite understand. And the agency, we actually did a very bad job of explaining that. They were heavily reliant on their lawyers or nonprofits that were assisting them because they were very afraid of making a mistake. One applicant told us that, they got something in the mail and it said, this is what the approval means, but it was incredibly vague. And so to actually dig into it and figure out what happened next, they would go online to these forums where they talk to other asylum seekers, and they would essentially be crowdsourcing information about what exactly does this mean, what can I expect to happen next, exactly when the next step will happen, and they would just try to put together an average by reading stories from other people. And this was so disappointing to us because it really forced us to think, we definitely need to do better because people are relying on other people and they're not actually relying on our resources because our resources don't make sense to them. Another thing we heard often from applicants was that they didn't trust themselves alone to navigate the process because of how confusing it was. So one applicant told us they couldn't work because they were in the US on a student visa, and they originally weren't planning to hire a lawyer, but through reading online and talking to other applicants, they realized it makes a huge difference whether or not your case gets approved. So they hired one last minute right before they filed, and it was incredibly expensive. They, at the time, had already spent over $8,000 in legal fees, money that they didn't quite have just yet. And so it really challenged us, how might we design a system where it doesn't rely on having to hire external help, where you feel confident that you can navigate the process alone, and you don't need to have that third party in order to be confident that you can get a successful and fair decision. And unsurprisingly, the channels that we were working with were not great. So this was the asylum website at the time, and even though I was working at the agency, I had no idea how to navigate this. And you can see on the right, there's these links. Every time there was a lawsuit filed against the agency, there was a new regulation that they had to adhere to, and they just put a link there. And they were just like, you can read this if you'd like. Not very user-friendly. And so we really wanted to figure out how can we make this better so that people actually understood what was happening next through official communication channels. Another thing we heard often from applicants was it took forever to hear back. Because it was so hard to understand what was happening, they sent a lot of questions to offices. And offices were incredibly overwhelmed because it took so long. They would send the same question in many different channels. They would call, they would email, they would go to an office in person, and offices were incredibly overwhelmed by directing staff to answer these questions. Often they were repeats of the same question from the same person. They had fewer staff that could actually go work on cases and get people a decision sooner, which is what they really wanted. And in one of the offices we visited, we realized it was actually so full of paper, there was nowhere to sit down. And so the thing that we left with as we did this first preliminary research was we came to the conclusion that applicants need more understanding, and with more understanding comes more control. And so we really focus on, let's try to invest in a couple projects where we're really building up a better content strategy. We make it clear to applicants what's happening and why. What are the steps they can take? What is the how behind how they can actually take those steps, and maybe a hint of what actually happens next. And so what we did next was to do a little bit more research to better understand some of the key pain points in the journey and what were some projects we could invest in to improve the applicant-facing experience. We did this by first interviewing about 14 affirmative asylum seekers. And let me actually tell you, this was incredibly difficult to get people to speak with us because we were all working at US Citizenship and Immigration Services, which, if you're not familiar, is an agency within the Department of Homeland Security. And so all our emails said at uscis.dhs.gov. At the time, there were all these headlines about DHS really rounding people up. So it totally made sense that anytime we connected with someone, they were very hesitant to speak with us. Even when we spoke to lawyers or nonprofits that did a lot of work helping groups of asylum seekers, they refused to introduce us to their clients because they didn't trust what our intentions were. They didn't understand if participating in this research would actually impact their case. And so it took a lot of time and getting in the ground with different organizations, investing time with them to really build relationships and get people to agree to speak with us, making sure that they understood that anything they said in the interview, any complaints or grievances they aired, would not go back to impact their overall decision for their case. Another thing we did was to really supplement this, we wanted to observe something that a lot of offices offer called Inquiry Day. And so a lot of offices, they'll designate one specific day of the week where applicants can come in and they can ask questions. And so our team was based in Washington, D.C. at the time. We went to the nearest asylum office in Arlington, Virginia, and we did intercept interviews with about 20 applicants. So after they came in, waited in line, filled out a form, asked someone in the office their question, we would ask if we could talk to them for 5 minutes, ask them when they applied, how long ago that was, what they were waiting for next, and any feedback they had about how to improve the process. And then because we only spoke to 20 people that day, we also analyzed the data from a lot of these inquiry days in the past over the last few months. And so every time people came in, they asked a question, they actually filled out a paper form. So we had a whole stack of paper forms, and we could go and find some of the most frequently asked questions. And so this is an example of what that form looked like. It lived right behind the counter where people were asking those questions, and we were able to take a look and understand what were some of the key things that people kept asking over and over again, and how could we build this into some of the services that we wanted to improve. And so we ended with a plan to invest in 3 key projects where we would try to improve the applicant-facing experience. The first was Case Status Online. So this is actually a service that was available at the time to general immigration services. So someone applying for a green card or some other immigration form, they could actually go online, enter a number, and they would be able to see the status of their case, what happened next. This was not available to affirmative asylum applicants. So this is something that we wanted to invest in so that if people were asking all these questions about what was the status of their case online, in phone, in person, they could just go online to check that. The second thing that we wanted to invest in was, as I showed you earlier, that website, trying to redesign the content there, not only for the headquarters, for the national office, but also for each individual local office as well. And then finally, we wanted to introduce online appointment booking. So a lot of offices, when they had Inquiry Day, there was actually no way to guarantee that you were able to speak to someone that day. And there's actually only about, I want to say 7 or 8 offices in the entire country. So you could live a few states over. If you want to go in, you have to maybe drive for 4 or 5 hours, and then go in, wait all day, and just hope that you got to speak to someone that day. So we wanted to introduce, using some of the same tools that the team offered for booking a visa appointment, a chance to go book an appointment in an office and know for sure you can plan around it that you would get to speak to someone that day. So what happened a few months later? We were actually able to launch Case Status Online. We happened to launch it in January of 2019, during at the time was the longest government shutdown. And I was on a team of about, I want to say 12 people. And in the middle, Congress didn't approve funding for our agency. And so about everyone but myself and another coworker was not allowed to work. So we were sitting there, me and my coworker, and we were like, can we launch this? The people we would normally check with are not allowed to work. So we did end up launching it. A few days later, they approved the funding and they came back to work and they're like, good job, that was fine. And yet we still knew that even though we had done all that research up front, there were probably still a lot of gaps that our team had, and there were a lot of improvements. So we did some light usability testing after that launch, and we found there was still a lot of work that we could do to improve that content. So one of those, for example, was we had this case status online tool. Even after someone entered their number, we still got a lot of questions around what exactly can I do in this stage of the process, and what exactly is happening next. So we explored some ideas and concepts for outlining the full step of the process and highlighting which specific step the applicant was in. Another thing that we heard was when you apply for asylum, you get a piece of paper in the mail, and on that piece of paper are two numbers. One is an A number, that is for you as an individual, and one is an RCPT number for your case. And on the tool, we said, enter your receipt number. And so a lot of people actually didn't know what that meant, because it's not specifically referred to as a receipt number explicitly in their paper form that they got. And so we went and thought, okay, we need to go back, we need to add a tooltip or add some, in parentheses, not just receipt number, but specifically call out RCPT number. And so it was more clear to applicants which number from that form that they actually need to enter to find the status of their case. The website was actually very interesting, and this was a scenario where we had a lot of grand ideas, and it was on the surface a very simple project where we had a lot of ideas for how to improve the information architecture. But as we got into it and started redesigning one specific local office and also the overall asylum program's website, we realized actually that some offices were going rogue on policy. So headquarters actually had some very specific standardized policies where they wanted to make sure that if an applicant was emailing over a question and they had included personally identifiable information in that email, that they use a different secure email messaging platform in order to contact the field office. And field offices were just ignoring that completely. And they just said on their website, oh, you can just email questions to this email address and that's fine. And so instead of it being a very simple process to actually redesign the content on the website, it actually forced a lot of hard conversations about some of these policies. And we had to work and put the web design project on pause until we could actually get headquarters and local field offices to align on what those policies should be before we could finalize the content that we actually wanted. So that was something that ended up happening a few months later. And then finally, for online appointments, we were able to launch this in February of 2019. But one of the challenges that happened when we actually ended up launching this was we realized at the time that we were building this, we weren't actually aligned with local offices on the critical problem to solve. So our team, and we had limited experience working on the asylum program, our goal was just to make it easy for people to make appointments. We wanted to make sure that people could come in and have the security knowing that they would be seen that day. What a lot of offices actually wanted to use the online appointment booking tool, though, for was to limit the number of appointments and also start to eliminate walk-ins. So they actually wanted to make sure that it was required that people had an appointment, and some of them, the offices wanted to turn people away who had planned to walk in. And without an actual communications plan for when exactly this would go into effect, this was actually something that we were not equipped to do as an agency. So we launched this, but also worked on a separate plan to make sure that there was some transition period for the offices that were trying to make sure all those questions went into appointments and fewer of them came into walk-ins. And finally, and this was actually incredibly important, as we got into this work, we were only a few months in, our team anyway, and we realized that we were actually thinking about the problem completely differently. And part of the challenge for why we thought about it in not quite the right angle was because we had a lot of recruiting bias. So I said earlier, it was very difficult for us to get applicants to speak with us. And what that meant was the one-on-one interviews we did, where we spent an hour with an applicant, a lot of these actually happened to be very recent asylum applicants. And so it was very natural, since they hadn't actually gone through the agonizing process of waiting for many years. The things they complained to us about were the form was confusing, the website was confusing, and those were things that were top of mind because that's all they had gone through at that point in time. Meanwhile, when we did the intercepts in the field offices, a lot of these applicants had applied years ago. And they had the same complaints, but the website being bad was not one of them. all they really wanted was to just get a decision sooner. They were in this uncertain phase. They couldn't plan for their future because they didn't know whether or not they would get approved. And they just wanted to get a decision sooner. But the problem is we only spoke to those people for 5 minutes. And so when we were collecting our research, we had a little bit of bias on our team because we remembered all the pain points from the people we spoke to for an hour. And we kind of remember the things about the people we spoke to for 5 minutes, but it was a little bit more prevalent for us, the people we spent simply more time with. And it only took going back and digging into this after being in the project for a couple months to really realize this bias. And so it helped us think about the problem that we are solving differently. We realized a lot of the projects that we were working on today were really focused on making it easier for applicants to wait in line. So you're in a really long line, we're giving you water or something to watch, and that's great, but what you really want is to not be in line. And so we started thinking about, okay, what are things that we can do and invest in to make the line shorter or make the line go faster? Everything else is really nice to have, but it's not as important. And this challenged us to ask a different question, which was, how might we reduce the asylum backlog from 300,000 to 0 in 5 years? And challenging that ambition to us helped us look at a couple other things that we weren't spending time with before. So we noticed and dug into the data and found out in certain offices, there was a much higher reschedule rate. And we wanted to figure out why. And maybe there were things we could invest in to reduce that reschedule rate in those specific offices. We found out that for a lot of applicants, they were actually stuck in this uncertain part of the process because they had moved between different states. Their cases were being handed back and forth between different offices, and no one was actually working on some of their cases because a lot of the officers were assigned to local offices. So we started thinking about a staffing plan. Maybe some of the people who were in headquarters, the asylum officers in headquarters who were between cases or working on different projects, they could actually pitch in and help close out some of those cases that had that uncertain status. And so that really helped inform the next phase of our work with this project, which I don't have time to get into, and also because some members of our team got put on another fire. But this was really important to make sure we were solving the right problem and making sure we were concentrating our efforts for improving the service experience in the most effective way for what mattered to our users. And so last, I just want to end with a couple of tips that we learned through doing this work, researching with very vulnerable communities. The first of which was to really make that ask in real life. And what I mean by this is really, we found through doing this work, compared to my background before working in B2B software, we had to invest a little bit more time in building that relationship before you could ask someone to participate in research. We also found that we needed to reorder the typical interview procedure. So I was used to, if I had a waiver or disclosure for someone to sign, just asking them to do it at the beginning, but it was an incredibly intimidating form that we were given to have applicants sign. It had the DHS logo on it. And so we found it was actually more effective to build trust by asking people to sign that at the end. We would take the time to walk through it, and they already knew what the interview was all about at that point. So they were more willing to just recognize it as a formality. Third, we really wanted to make sure that we were very intentional about securing and anonymizing that data. So whenever we took notes, we wanted to make sure we had as limited amount of information to distinguish one applicant from the other. Oftentimes, we only included the country that the applicant was applying from, and that was just enough so that we could remember who we were talking about, but also not so much information so that the applicant felt confident whatever they said would not be tied to their eventual case for their eventual interview with an officer. And then finally, we wanted to be very intentional about the location that we met applicants in. So coming from previously working on B2B software, it was very easy. Oh, your office or mine, right? But at the time, we were working in this big, intimidating government building, the same building that applicants would go to eventually for their case. And they already had the concern that by talking to us, it would impact the decision on their case. So we learned through a few of the first people that we spoke to that a lot of them participated in ESL language circles at their local public library, and we just met them at the library closest to whatever was most convenient for them. And that was a neutral third place for them to feel comfortable interacting with us, see us as just like another person trying to learn about them, trying to make something better for them, instead of an intimidating person coming from government. And so today I talked a little bit more about the work that we did on the US Asylum program, a little bit about how the design and data work that we did inspired a pivot in the organization strategy, and lessons that I learned personally when doing a lot of this research. Thank you so much.
First question, were you able to improve user trust throughout the course of your research? If so, how?
Yeah. So I think it's hard to say because one of the challenges in doing this work is there were not very reliable data sources that the organization was monitoring. And so we knew from anecdotal feedback that it was better, but it was not something that the organization was tracking across the board during the time of this project. So yes, but probably not to the same standards that you and I are used to in other organizations.
Yeah. How are you able to push for alignment of policy between different offices? There a little bit more. Were there specific asks that offices would not budge on, and how did you handle that?
Yeah, so I think a lot of those conversations, it was really about making sure that people were on the same page about the root cause of why offices were ignoring the existing policy. And it was really that it was too difficult for their staff to look at all of these different messaging channels and reasonably be able to respond to all of them in a timely manner. And so that's one of the reasons why it was just easier. Like if they were assigning a person on their team to respond to applicant inquiries, they wanted to make sure that they weren't switching back and forth between two different tools, especially if oftentimes the applicant sent the same question to each of them. and so I think just by making sure that, headquarters understood that it wasn't because they were ignoring it for no reason. We could think about how we can invest in better tooling internally for those offices so that we could solve that problem, but also make sure that there were the right functionality in place to secure the data.
Wonderful. While you were doing research, did you struggle with any language barriers?
Yeah, that's a good question. We did. So there were some interviews that we did where an applicant, they asked to have a representative help translate just in case there were some details that they didn't feel confident in communicating. Oftentimes, this was their legal representative or someone from the nonprofit that was helping with their case. So someone they were comfortable with, and someone who also understood the details of the process.
Okay. Could you expand on how working on a federal project like this differs from the private sector? And did any of your solutions receive pushback?
Yeah. The short answer is very different and absolutely yes. So I would say a couple key things that are different that from my experience anyway, working on a federal project and in contrast to the private sector. And I will say at the time that I did this work, I had only worked at a very small startup. So it's like basically night and day in terms of difference. One of them is definitely the pace of the work. That was something that I had to get used to, just knowing that we weren't failing because things took a little bit longer. That was normal, and it's actually good. It's to make sure that, in case of a political transition, it's not as easy to completely change or eliminate a program overnight, which does happen. And then I will say also another big thing is in government, there's actually a lot of times a lot of government contractors working on a program or project. And so not only are you working with people who are officially government employees, you're also working with contractors, and there's just like a lot of different parties with a couple different interests involved. And so that's definitely something to navigate. Whereas in my experience anyway, previously working in the private sector, I had mostly worked with an entirely in-house team.
Wonderful. I'm sure it's just so
That's
different.
just like the tip. Yeah, there's definitely more.
Yeah. Did any of your interventions involve adjustment to processes themselves? Was that an option, or were interventions restricted to technological adds changes?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think actually it was interesting because our organization, we would get in the door because there was a technology component to the project. But actually, in investigating and doing the design work, we surfaced to the organization that their real problem was either a process or a policy problem. And we could ship the best technical solution to the problem. But if they didn't fix the process, they weren't going to get the result they needed. And so definitely, there were many instances where we invested in a technology solution and then also, co-designed a solution to the process problem with federal employees.
Cool. You may or may not know this, and it's been around 4 years since launch. What is the backlog down to now? Are you on track for the goal of 0 backlog in 5 years?
I definitely don't know the exact number now. But I will say, I'm pretty sure the backlog is worse. And it's not only worse for asylum, it's worse for overall immigration services because of the many months or maybe even years that offices were closed during the pandemic. And so there's just been I've heard across the board from just, friends or coworkers who are going through just any immigration services that it takes forever, much longer even than before, to get any kind of appointment.
Yeah, I can imagine. There's another question around moving the needle, and similar to that. Maybe you can go more on that with the KPIs on Slack. How did you handle the overwhelming feelings and empathy that comes from dealing with the problems asylum seekers have?
Yeah. I will say, actually, that is probably one area where our team did not actually build enough team rituals for, all of us working on this project to make sure we were taking care of ourselves and we were mindful of, taking that time to reflect as a group before we moved on to trying to solve the problem. So I don't actually know if I have, I guess I don't really have much to say, except we probably could have done better there.
Sounds like there's a lot of self-management of that themselves rather than
as a group, which we probably should have done. Yeah.
Any advice from moving from the corporate world to government?
Oh, that's a good question.
Do it, don't do it?
Oh, definitely do it. I definitely recommend it. It is for me anyway, I was actually living in DC before I joined the USCS. And so it was really nice to feel like I could take a lot of the skills I had developed and really apply them to some of the things I would see in the headlines every single day. I think though, definitely the biggest adjustment for me was how much we were expected to just deal with a ton of uncertainty while at the same time trying to provide some degree of certainty to the people who brought us into the problem in the first place. And so that was definitely challenging, but I'm sure it's actually something many of us have dealt with in pretty much everywhere we've ever worked. It's just even more pressing when the problem is so meaningful.
It's really interesting insights. Thank you so much, Crystal, and let's give her another round of applause.
Thank you.